Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's a really great pleasure to be joined by Victor Mallet as our guest today. Victor is a distinguished journalist and an author who's worked across the world for more than 3 decades. The author of several books, including most recently a book about the River Ganges and India. But Victor is best known to those who follow Hong Kong as the former Asian news editor of the Financial Times, who was expelled from Hong Kong in October 2018, almost exactly a year to the day after I was denied entry in 2017. He had served as the vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong, which a club that I used to be an active member of. And it was at his expulsion from the city that was one of the key turning points and one of the early signs of worse to come. Victor, I wonder if I could start just by asking you to recap those events that led to your expulsion from Hong Kong and what happened.
Well, it's a bit like Hemingway talking about bankruptcy. I think, Hong Kong's freedoms were lost, at first gradually and then suddenly. And I think, what happened to me was obviously very minor in comparison to the things that happened subsequently. But it was, the first time a foreign correspondent had their work permit denied in Hong Kong, not in China, but in Hong Kong. And it was kind of the first stage, I think, of what became a very drastic process of Hong Kong's autonomy and Hong Kong's freedoms that were supposedly guaranteed under the Basic Law and the agreements with the UK that were being taken away. So, I mean, I simply hosted at the Foreign Correspondents Club a meeting with a local politician, a young local politician called Andy Chen, and he was attacked by the Beijing government. The Communist Party didn't like him, didn't want him to speak. But the event went ahead anyway because when the Chinese authorities told me that we couldn't have it, I said, but Hong Kong has freedoms and we allow people to speak at the club, whether they're the Chinese government or opponents of the Chinese government. This has happened forever at the Foreign Correspondents Club, and it will continue to happen because those freedoms are guaranteed under the Basic Law. And then we heard nothing more about it. And then a couple of months later, my work visa my work permit was denied, and I wasn't allowed entry. And although no official statement was made, it was very clear from the sort of pro-Beijing members of the LegCo that this was revenge for the event where we had hosted an opposition politician, if you like, at the FCC.
And what went through your mind? I mean, how did you feel about leaving the city that you had called home, I think, for some time? And of course, now, like me, you presumably can never go back to unless things change for the better. What were the emotions that you felt at the time?
Well, I think initially surprised. We certainly didn't have any clue that this was coming. There was no indication that this was going to happen. So I was quite shocked, actually. But then, subsequently, obviously saddened by the fact that I couldn't go back. We had a lot of friends there. We had a lot of contacts there. I mean, I was never a sort of Hong Kong expert or even a China expert, really. Hong Kong was the base from which we at the Financial Times, where I have been for many years. That was our Asia base where we run our editorial operations from. So it was a convenient center from which to go to China, but also to Japan, Korea, India, and so on. So and Southeast Asia. So it was a shock. It was a surprise, and it was very sad that we were not able to see a lot of our Hong Kong friends, or indeed say goodbye to them in many cases.
Absolutely. At the time, we all saw what happened to you as a pretty significant blow to press freedom. But of course, so much worse was still to come. How do you assess what has happened to press freedom in Hong Kong in the past 4 years since you were forced to leave?
Absolutely. I mean, excluding one foreign correspondent from Hong Kong is not a big deal in comparison with what happened subsequently, which of course was essentially the dismantling of Hong Kong's autonomy from China, starting, with we had you remember the sequence of events. There was some very large peaceful demonstrations against a security law in 2019, which then the government of Carrie Lam did not respond to that, and nor did the Beijing government. And essentially, the protests and the police action then turned violent. And then, in the wake of all that, we had the closure of Apple Daily, the arrest of Jimmy Lai, and then the detention of a lot of democratic politicians who were, and of course in the middle of all this, and the basis on which they were detained was the national security law, which was imposed on Hong Kong. Even the Hong Kong authorities didn't know what was happening. It was just, they were just told, this is it, this is what you're going to do. And they, of course, accepted that, and then that law was imposed and then applied to the people of Hong Kong. So we've got an extraordinary situation now where there's 47 people in jail, essentially accused, as far as I can tell from the charges, of having tried to win an election, which was essentially their job as politicians. Obviously, that was what they wanted to do, but they were accused of having this primary to try and make sure they got control of the LegCo, and this was regarded as subversive under the new national security law, which is an incredibly broad law. So you've had media publications closed, you've had a lot of people have gone into exile, and a lot of people have been detained. So this is not anything like the situation that we had before, where Hong Kong did have genuine autonomy, at least in the sense of press freedom and freedom of association, which really no longer exists.
Absolutely. Within this context, what do you see as the future for the Foreign Correspondents Club?
That's a bit hard to say, because I'm not there and I haven't been there, and I hear from a distance, reports of what's going on. I sort of sympathize with the people who are trying to run the place now, although they have in some cases been sort of criticized for their stand. For example, cancelling the human rights awards, human rights press awards that we had. But I think it's an impossible situation. If you are somewhere, you have to obey the laws of the country you're in, and it's impossible to do that while maintaining absolute press freedom, which was the case before. When I had that event, that was the source of my expulsion, the cause of my expulsion. I mean, there was absolutely no question that it was legal, and that it was legal to host anybody we wanted, who could say anything they wanted, as short of calling for violence. And that is now no longer the case. There are very severe constraints on what people can say and what people can do in Hong Kong politically. And that must make it extremely difficult to run a press club. I mean, it's not the only country in which press clubs have those kind of problems, but it just makes it very difficult when you're in if you confrontation, if you like, with the authorities over essentially the purpose of the club is to stand for press freedom and to be a social center. And of course, you can maintain your activities as a social center, but it's very difficult to maintain your activities as a center for the free press if the laws don't really allow you to do so in full measure.
Absolutely. You touched a moment ago on some of the arrests and trials, and of course Jimmy Lai's national security law trial is coming up next month. He's already been in prison for 2 years or so on awaiting trial and on some other charges, but the big national security law trial is coming up. What more do you think the international community could or should be doing for him?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's not clear that, people like you and me and even governments shouting about things is going to help. I think probably what we can all do to the best of our abilities is simply to tell the truth and to call out the lies and to call out the obfuscations that are coming from the governments of China and the government of Hong Kong. I think the main thing is to be absolutely clear about what the actual situation is. I think appealing for them to change their minds is not going to work. But I think if we can simply lay out the realities of Hong Kong today, the realities of China today, will go a long way towards putting pressure or at least exposing the reality of what's happening. I think certainly as a journalist, that's obviously my main role, if you like. And the same applies, for example, with Russia in the Ukraine war. The best we can do is to simply expose what is happening, report what is happening, and then hopefully the people of the world will see what the reality is and not believe some of the lies that are told by some of the actors in this whole, sorry saga.
Absolutely. Looking at Hong Kong with your Financial Times hat on, what's your sense of what the combination of both the political crackdown and at the same time the COVID lockdown has done to Hong Kong's status as a global financial center?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because, of course, a bit like when we're talking about Brexit and the effects of Brexit, the COVID pandemic has kind of muddied the waters for everything because, of course, Hong Kong was closed down for that reason. And therefore, it's very hard to sort of tease out what caused what. But I think, when you look back over the longer term, over a longer period, and sort of when the COVID pandemic has perhaps faded into the background, I think probably the most significant thing is that Hong Kong was an attraction because it was different from the rest of China. It was a place where the rule of law applied. It was also, of course, a great logistical hub for people to travel from. But the main reason was the legal system that allowed law firms, investment bankers, financiers, industrial companies, and everybody to have their headquarters, to have their contracts enforced, and so on. And I think the loss of a really independent system of rule of law and the loss of a free press, which of course helps to keep under sort of control, if you like, any legal system, or at least to expose any shortcomings that there might be in the legal system or the political system. The loss of that independence, that autonomy, the loss of a kind of fundamentally independent legal system. And it's not that the lawyers are at fault for not being independent. It's if the laws are so vaguely worded that it's almost impossible not to be in breach of the law. If somebody so decides that you are in breach, then it becomes almost impossible. And of course, what people will say is what they always said about Singapore, which is, well, it's fine because the restrictions and the authoritarianism only applies to politics and doesn't apply to business. But you can see how it's very hard to separate, business and politics. I mean, we saw the case of a couple of Canadians who were essentially held and detained in China as kind of hostages in exchange for the woman from Huawei who was held in Canada. So there is, once you lose that independent judiciary or the ability of an independent judiciary to act in a responsible way, once you lose your autonomy, then I think it's very, very difficult. And so the danger is that very slowly, although Hong Kong is still a conduit for money going in and out of China, and is therefore useful to the Chinese, but the danger is that it becomes more and more like any other city in China, because politically it's become more and more like any other city in China. Although there's still a sort of residual, element of free press, but you'll notice that this is very much, it tends to be focused on the sort of English language press, which they don't care so much about, so the South China Morning Post, or more importantly, the Hong Kong Free Press, they can sort of say things which RTHK, the public broadcaster, isn't going to say, and which, Apple Daily can no longer say because it's being closed down, so it just leaches away that the great strength of Hong Kong, which was its kind of status as an autonomous part of China. And I think that will ultimately, in the long term, make it a less attractive place to do business, if you like. I mean, I wouldn't say business will go to zero, but it's clearly not as attractive as it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Just drawing towards a close, a penultimate question. There's now a significant Hong Kong diaspora around the world, particularly in the UK, but also in places like Canada, Australia, and the US, because of what's happened in Hong Kong. And that includes many Hong Kong media professionals. And in fact, there's a new organization being set up for them the Association of Overseas Hong Kong Media Professionals. What, if any, engagement do you still have with the diaspora from Hong Kong, and how do you see their role in the struggle for Hong Kong's future?
So, I mean, professionally, obviously, for the last few years, I've really been focusing on France. We've had French elections and we've had the war in Ukraine and so on. But you know, on a personal level, of course, I've met a lot of these people as they come. A lot of them have come through Paris as well as going through London. And yeah, I think, and a lot of them, of course, I mean, the extraordinary talents of Hong Kong people, whether they're journalists or accountants or anything else, are there for all to see. And of course, the UK is going to benefit, I think, greatly from a sort of mass migration of people from Hong Kong who are incredibly skilled. They're almost all multilingual, and these people are very quickly going to make a very good go of it in whatever country they end up, whether it's Canada or the UK. And I think the journalists the same, and of course they have an incredibly important role to play as Cantonese speakers and as Chinese speakers to sort of explain to the rest of the world what is going on in Hong Kong and what is going on in China. And I think that, for me, that's one of their very important roles, as well as, of course, getting on with their own lives in the new places where they're living. But you're right. I mean, I don't think we really know the full extent of the migration from Hong Kong. I mean, I know several, many people who've left who are not political. They're not even journalists. They're just people who do not want their children to be educated under a system where, the state tells you what to think. So that there's a very large number of people who probably haven't declared that they've left Hong Kong, but have simply left and have ended up largely in the UK, but also in a whole bunch of other countries around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's wonderful in the UK. I mean, I now go down the street where I live and regularly bump into Hong Kongers who know me because of the work I do and always greet me in a wonderful way. So I sometimes say I can no longer go to Hong Kong, but it feels like Hong Kong is coming to me, which well, that's sad, but it's also
absolutely it's true, but it's sad, isn't it? Because we have. I mean, I think the other thing is we shouldn't forget the people who are essentially political prisoners in Hong Kong, who are being held. I mean, really, the wording of the charges and what they are accused of is quite extraordinary in any, certainly in sort of historical context of Hong Kong and its judicial system. And it's outrageous also that they have not been granted bail when they're clearly not a danger to society. And this seems to be a sort of unnecessarily vengeful approach to political enemies. And a lot of those people, as you mentioned, Jimmy Lai, the trial is coming up, or the trials are coming up quite soon. And I hope that the whole world pays very close attention to that, because, this is, in a way, this is the sort of culmination of the destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy. So we should keep an eye out for that, and again, explain and report very clearly what's happening. Even if we're not making, a political point or trying to campaign on that basis, which of course you are, which I understand, but the rest of us in the media, we just have to sort of lay out what is happening and let people judge for themselves what they think of it.
Absolutely. Well, that's an extremely good and important note on which to almost end. But I was going to ask if you have a sort of final message for people who are watching this, and particularly Hong Kongers themselves, wherever they may be.
Bon courage, I would say to people, keep up the good work. I mean, I know a lot of very courageous, very good journalists who have done extraordinary work in Hong Kong and continue to do extraordinary work either in Hong Kong or outside Hong Kong. As I said, I think we should just carry on doing that work to the best of our ability and fight. There is one fight, I would recommend, and that is fighting against fake news, which is, and not just fake news, but the kind of messaging that authoritarian governments are able to put across. And apparently, managing to convince large numbers of people, whether in the United States or in Europe. We've seen both the Chinese and the Russian sort of propaganda machines have been very active in recent months and years, and sometimes alarmingly effective. So the role of us Hong Kong watchers and the media in particular is to make sure that those messages, which are essentially untruths, are not effective, and that the real situation, wherever it is, whether it's in Russia or China or Hong Kong, actually gets out to the general reader or the general viewer, so that people can see what's really happening.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much more we could discuss, but we've come to the end of our time. Victor Mallet, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Ben.